Good evening. Tonight we delve into one of the most controversial murder cases in American history. A case that divided a community, that challenged the justice system, that inspired some of the most important feminist literature of the 20th century, and a case that more than 120 years later remains officially unsolved. On a cold December night in 1900 in the farmlands of Warren County, Iowa, a man was murdered in his own bed. 2 brutal blows from an axe while he slept. His wife, Margaret Hossack, was lying beside him. The question that haunted 2 trials, captivated the nation, and continues to echo through history is simple. Did she do it? This is the story of Margaret Hossack, a story of violence and survival, of justice and injustice, of secrets hidden in plain sight, a story where the truth may never be fully known. The year is 1900, the dawn of a new century. America is changing rapidly. Cities are growing, technology is advancing, the modern world is taking shape. But in rural Iowa, in the farming communities of Warren County, life moves at a different pace. Here, families work the land, neighbors know each other's business, and the rhythms of life are dictated by seasons and harvests. The Hossack farm sits about 9 miles from Indianola, the county seat. It's a working farm, modest but productive, the kind of place that requires constant labor from everyone in the family. John Hossack is 59 years old, a farmer born in Scotland. He's lived in Iowa for decades. By all accounts, he's successful, respected in some circles. But there's another side to John Hossack, a darker side. Margaret Hossack is 52 years old, a farmer's wife, a mother to 9 children, though some have already left home. She's known in the community as hardworking, devoted to her family. But those who know her well, they see something else. They see bruises, they hear arguments, they witness fear, because behind the closed doors of the Hossack farmhouse there is violence, years of it. And on December 1st, 1900, that violence would reach its terrible conclusion. December 1st, 1900, a Saturday night, the temperature is dropping, winter is settling into Iowa. At the Hossack farm, the day's work is done, the family prepares for bed. John and Margaret retire to their bedroom on the first floor of the farmhouse. Their children are elsewhere in the house. Some upstairs, some in adjacent rooms. It's a typical night, or so it seems. According to Margaret's later testimony, she and John went to bed around 9 o'clock. The house settled into darkness and quiet. And then, sometime after midnight, Margaret says she was awakened, not by a sound inside the house, but by a door slamming. She opened her eyes and saw a flash of light, not from a lamp, not from a candle, just a flash. And then she felt something was wrong. She reached over in the darkness and touched her husband. His head was wet, warm, sticky, blood. Margaret called out for her children. Ivan, one of her sons, came running. They lit a lamp, and there, in the bed beside Margaret, was John Hossack. His head had been struck, twice, with tremendous force. Blood covered the pillow, the sheets, the headboard. But John Hossack was still alive, barely conscious, making groaning sounds. Margaret and the children tried to help him. They cleaned the wounds. They tried to make him comfortable. But there was nothing they could do. By morning, John Hossack would be dead. Word spread quickly through the rural community. John Hossack had been murdered in his own bed in the middle of the night. The sheriff arrived. Doctors examined the body. Neighbors gathered. The wounds were devastating. 2 blows to the head, both delivered with an axe or similar weapon. The first blow had fractured the skull. The second had been even more powerful. Either blow, the doctors determined, could have been fatal. But who would do such a thing? And how did they get into the house? Margaret told investigators her story. She was awakened by a door slamming. She saw a flash of light. She found her husband injured. She heard nothing else. I saw no one. The house was searched. The doors were examined. The windows were checked. And then, about 70 feet from the house, investigators made a discovery. An axe. The family's axe. One that was normally kept near the house for splitting wood. It was lying on the ground, and there was blood on it. Fresh blood, still wet. The murder weapon had been found. But the identity of the murderer, that remained a mystery. Or did it? As investigators interviewed the family and searched the property, suspicion began to focus on one person, Margaret Hossack herself. She had been in the bed with John when he was attacked. How could someone enter the room, strike him twice with an axe, and leave without her waking up? How could she sleep through such violence happening inches away from her? And then investigators learned something else, something that would become central to the case. Margaret Hossack had a motive, a powerful one. As the investigation progressed, a disturbing picture emerged. The Hossack marriage was not what it appeared to be from the outside. Neighbors came forward, friends of the family, even some of the Hossack children, and they all told the same story. John Hossack was violent. He had been for years. Margaret had been beaten repeatedly. The abuse was not hidden. It was known throughout the community. Neighbors had heard the arguments, had seen Margaret's injuries. One neighbor testified that Margaret had come to her home multiple times over the years, frightened, sometimes injured. She had expressed fear for her life and for her children's lives. Another witness recalled seeing Margaret with bruises on her face and arms. When asked about them, she had been evasive, ashamed, but everyone knew what was happening. The children had witnessed it too. Some testified that their father had a terrible temper, that he would lash out at Margaret without warning, that the household lived in constant tension, never knowing when violence would erupt. This was Margaret Hossack's life. Not for months, not for a year or two, for decades. She had married John Hossack when she was young. They had built a life together, raised 9 children, but that life had been punctuated by violence, by fear, by survival, and now her husband was dead, killed in their bed, and investigators believed she had finally had enough. The theory was straightforward. After years of abuse, Margaret Hossack had reached her breaking point. She had waited until John was asleep, vulnerable, and she had taken the family axe and ended her torment. It made sense. It was logical. And the community, despite knowing about John's violence, began to turn against Margaret. On December 3, 1900, just 2 days after John's death, Margaret Hossack was arrested and charged with murder. The news sent shockwaves through Warren County. A wife, a mother, a respectable woman, accused of murdering her husband with an axe. Margaret maintained her innocence. She had not killed her husband, she insisted. She had been asleep beside him. She had heard nothing, seen nothing except that flash of light. Someone else had done this terrible thing. But who? That was the question prosecutors would ask at trial. Who else could have done it? Margaret was held in the county jail. Her children visited when they could. Some believed in her innocence, others weren't sure. The family was torn apart, not just by John's death, but by the suspicion surrounding Margaret. As the months passed, the case became a sensation. Newspapers across Iowa covered every development. The story had everything: violence, mystery, a woman accused of the ultimate transgression. And among those following the case was a young journalist named Susan Glaspell. She worked for the Des Moines Daily News, and she would be sent to cover the trial. What Susan Glaspell witnessed in that courtroom would stay with her for years. It would shape her understanding of justice, gender, and the hidden lives of women. And eventually, it would inspire some of the most important feminist literature in American history. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, there would be a trial, April 1901, 4 months after John Hossack's death. The trial of Margaret Hossack begins in Indianola, Iowa. The courthouse is packed. This is the biggest trial Warren County has seen in years. People line up for seats. Reporters fill the press section. Margaret Hossack sits at the defense table. She's described by observers as calm, composed, almost stoic. She doesn't cry. She doesn't show emotion. She sits quietly listening to the proceedings. The jury is, of course, all male. Women were not allowed to serve on juries in Iowa in 1901. 12 men will decide Margaret's fate. The prosecution's case is built on circumstantial evidence. There are no witnesses to the actual murder. No one saw Margaret raise the axe. No one heard her strike the blows. But the circumstantial evidence, prosecutors argue, is overwhelming. First, opportunity. Margaret was in the bed with John when he was attacked. She claimed to have slept through the assault. But how believable is that? Two powerful axe blows, blood everywhere. The victim groaned and moved, and she supposedly heard nothing until a door slammed. The prosecution suggests this is impossible. The only explanation is that Margaret was awake, and not just awake, she was the one wielding the axe. Second, the murder weapon, the family's own axe, found just 70 feet from the house. Margaret had access to it. She knew where it was kept. And the blood on the blade, it was John Hossack's blood. Third, motive. This is where the prosecution's case becomes most compelling and most controversial. Witness after witness takes the stand to describe the abuse in the Hossack household. Neighbors testify that Margaret had complained about John's violence, that she had expressed fear for her safety, that she had said on more than one occasion that she didn't know how much more she could take. The prosecution's argument is simple. Margaret Hossack had endured years of abuse. She had reached her limit. And on that December night, she had taken matters into her own hands. But here's the bitter irony. The very abuse that might have justified Margaret's actions, if she had committed them, that same abuse is being used by the prosecution to convict her of murder. The defense argues differently. Yes, John Hossack was abusive. Yes, Margaret had suffered. But that doesn't mean she killed him. The defense presents an alternative theory. Someone else entered the house that night. Perhaps a robber. Perhaps someone with a grudge against John. They struck him while he slept and fled before anyone could see them. As for Margaret's calm demeanor during the attack, the defense suggests she was in shock, that the trauma of finding her husband dying had left her numb. But the defense faces a significant problem. They have no concrete evidence of an intruder, no footprints, no signs of forced entry, no stolen items, nothing to support the theory that someone else was in the house. The trial continues for days. Witnesses testify, evidence is examined, arguments are made, and throughout it all, Margaret sits quietly, not speaking, not showing emotion, just waiting. Finally, the case goes to the jury. 12 men retire to deliberate. Margaret's life hangs in the balance. The wait is not long. After just a few hours, the jury returns. The foreman stands. The judge asks for the verdict. Guilty. Margaret Hossack is convicted of murdering her husband. The sentence, life in prison. The verdict sends ripples through Iowa and beyond. Margaret Hossack, a 52-year-old mother of 9, will spend the rest of her life behind bars. Public opinion is divided. Some believe justice has been served, that Margaret murdered her husband and must pay the price. But others are troubled. Many people knew about John Hossack's violence. They knew Margaret had suffered for years, and now she's being punished not just for murder, but for surviving. The case raises difficult questions. Questions that society in 1901 is not equipped to answer. What happens when the law fails to protect women from domestic violence? When a woman has nowhere to turn, no one to help her? When her life is in danger, does she have the right to defend herself? And if she does defend herself, thus is that murder, or is it survival? These questions hang in the air as Margaret is taken to prison. But there's another aspect of the trial that bothers many observers. Something that Susan Glaspell, the young journalist, notices immediately. Margaret's demeanor, her calm, stoic behavior throughout the trial. To many in the courtroom, especially the male jurors, this calmness was disturbing. A woman whose husband has been murdered should be hysterical, they thought. She should cry, she should show grief, she should be emotional. Margaret's composure was seen as unfeminine, unnatural, and therefore evidence of guilt. But Susan Glaspell sees something different. She sees a woman who has learned over years of abuse not to show emotion, a woman who has survived by becoming stoic, by not reacting. She sees trauma, not guilt, but the jury, the all-male jury, sees something else entirely. This disconnect between how women experience trauma and how men interpret women's behavior, this will become central to Susan Glaspell's later work. But for now, in April 1901, Margaret Hossack is simply a convicted murderer on her way to prison. Margaret begins serving her sentence at the Iowa State Penitentiary. Life imprisonment. No possibility of parole. She will die in prison. Or so everyone believes. Margaret adapts to prison life as well as can be expected. She's a model prisoner, quiet, compliant. She works in the prison laundry. She attends services. She causes no trouble. Her children visit when they can, though the journey is difficult. Some have moved away. Some have their own families now. The scandal of their mother's conviction follows them. But something is happening outside the prison walls. Margaret's legal team has not given up. They're examining the trial record, looking for errors, searching for grounds to appeal, and they find something. A legal technicality. During the trial, certain evidence had been admitted that should have been excluded. The judge had made errors in his instructions to the jury. Small things, technical things, but in law, technicalities matter. Margaret's lawyers file an appeal with the Iowa Supreme Court. They argue that the trial was fundamentally flawed, that Margaret did not receive a fair hearing, and then they wait. Months pass. Margaret remains in prison. Hope is a dangerous thing, but it's all she has. Finally, the Iowa Supreme Court issues its ruling. The conviction is overturned. The court agrees that there were significant legal errors in the first trial. Margaret Hossack's conviction is vacated. She's granted a new trial, and in an unusual move, she's released on bail while awaiting that new trial. After 1 year in prison, Margaret Hossack walks free. February 1903, nearly 2.5 years after John Hossack's death, Margaret faces trial again. This time, the venue has changed. Due to concerns about pretrial publicity, the trial was moved to Clark County, adjacent to Warren County. A new jury, a new courtroom, but the same questions. Did Margaret Hossack murder her husband? The prosecution presents essentially the same case as before. The circumstantial evidence, the opportunity, the motive, the years of abuse that they argue drove Margaret to murder. But something has changed. The defense is more aggressive, more prepared. They've had time to build their case, to find weaknesses in the prosecution's theory. They hammer on the lack of direct evidence. No one saw Margaret commit the crime. No one heard her confess. The entire case is based on speculation and circumstantial evidence. They also emphasize alternative theory, that an intruder could have entered the house, that John Hossack had enemies, business disputes, people who might have wanted him dead. And they make another argument, one that resonates with some jurors. If Margaret Hossack had wanted to kill her husband, would she have done it this way, in their shared bed, with the entire family in the house? Wouldn't she have chosen a method that was less risky, less likely to wake everyone, less likely to get blood all over herself? The axe murder, the defense suggests, was brutal and impulsive, the act of someone in a rage, not the carefully planned action of a woman who had endured abuse for years. The trial stretches on. Both sides present their cases with renewed vigor. Margaret once again sits quietly, watching, waiting. Finally, the case goes to the jury, another group of 12 men. Once again, Margaret's fate is in their hands, but this time, something is different. The jury deliberates for hours, then days. They're deadlocked, unable to reach a unanimous verdict. The judge calls them back into the courtroom. He asks if further deliberation might help. The foreman shakes his head. They take a final vote. 9 jurors believe Margaret is guilty. 3 believe she is not. A hung jury. The judge has no choice but to declare a mistrial. Margaret Hossack will not be convicted. But she hasn't been acquitted either. The prosecution must now decide. Do they try her a third time? After much deliberation, they decide not to. 2 trials, 2 years of legal proceedings, and still no definitive answer. The state drops the charges. Margaret Hossack is free. Margaret returns to Indianola, not to the farm where John died. That's been sold. But to a modest home in town. She's free. But is she really? The community remains divided. Some neighbors welcome her back. Others avoid her. Some believe in her innocence. Others are certain of her guilt. Margaret herself says little. She doesn't grant interviews. She doesn't tell her story. She simply lives. She sees her children when she can. Some have remained loyal. Some have distanced themselves. The family, already fractured by John's violence, has been further torn apart by the trials. Margaret takes in sewing. She does odd jobs. She attends church. She tries to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. But the shadow of that December night follows her. Everywhere she goes, people whisper, is she the woman who got away with murder, or is she an innocent victim of circumstance? The years pass. Margaret grows older. Her health declines. On August 25th, 1916, Margaret Hossack dies in Indianola, Iowa. She's 68 years old. She takes her secrets with her. If she killed John Hossack, she never confessed. If she didn't kill him, she never learned who did. The case officially remains unsolved. The murder of John Hossack is still to this day an open investigation, though no one expects it will ever be closed. But Margaret's story didn't end with her death. In fact, in some ways, it was just beginning. Susan Glaspell, the young journalist who covered the first trial in 1901, never forgot the case. The image of Margaret sitting calmly in the courtroom, the testimony about years of abuse, the all-male jury convicting her based partly on her demeanor, all of it stayed with Susan. And in 1916, the same year Margaret died, Susan wrote a play, a one-act play called Trifles. The play is set in a rural farmhouse. A man has been killed in his bed, strangled with a rope. His wife is the primary suspect. The male investigators, a sheriff and a county attorney, search the house looking for evidence. But they dismiss the kitchen, the domestic spaces, as unimportant. Nothing here but kitchen things, they say. But two women accompany them, so the sheriff's wife and a neighbor. They notice things the men don't. They see the trifles, the quilt that's been sewn erratically as if by someone deeply distressed, the broken bird cage, and most tellingly, and the dead canary, its neck wrung, hidden in a sewing box. Through these domestic details and these trifles that the men overlook, the women reconstruct what happened. They understand that the wife had been isolated, abused, her joy slowly strangled, just like the bird, and they understand why she might have finally snapped. In the play, the women make a choice. They hide the evidence. They protect the accused wife because they understand something the men never will. They understand what it means to be trapped, to have no voice, no power, no escape. Trifles became one of the most important plays in American theater. And the following year, in 1917, Susan Glaspell adapted it into a short story, A Jury of Her Peers. The story became even more famous than the play. It's taught in schools and universities around the world. It's considered a cornerstone of feminist literature. And at its heart, it's the story of Margaret Hossack, or at least it's inspired by her story. Susan Glaspell saw what others didn't. She saw how gender bias had shaped Margaret's trial, how the male jury couldn't understand the reality of domestic abuse, how Margaret's stoicism was interpreted as guilt rather than trauma. She saw how women's experiences, women's knowledge, was dismissed as trifles, unimportant, trivial, not worth considering. But Susan knew better. She knew that those trifles, those small domestic details, they told a story that was anything but trivial. More than 120 years have passed since John Hossack was murdered, and we're no closer to knowing the truth than we were in 1900. Did Margaret Hossack kill her husband? Let's examine the evidence objectively. The case for Margaret's guilt is built on several pillars. First, she had motive, years of documented abuse, fear for her safety and her children's safety. Multiple witnesses confirm this. If anyone had a reason to want John Hossack dead, it was Margaret. Second, she had opportunity. She was in the bed with John when he was attacked. The murder weapon was the family's own axe, which she had access to. No one else was reported to be in the bedroom. Third, her explanation seems implausible to many. She claims she slept through two powerful axe blows delivered just inches from her. She heard a door slam and saw a flash of light, but nothing else. And fourth, there's no concrete evidence of any other suspect, no footprints, no signs of forced entry, no stolen items, nothing to suggest an intruder. But now, let's look at the case for Margaret's innocence. First, there's no direct evidence. Direct No one saw her commit the crime. No one heard a confession. The entire case rests on inference, not proof. No blood was found on Margaret's clothing. No witness placed an axe in her hands. No confession was ever made. And perhaps most troubling of all, no one could explain the flash of light Margaret described. In 1900, there were no car headlights passing country roads, no electric lamps outside farmhouses. That detail, so strange, so easily dismissed, was never fully explored. There were also unanswered questions about the axe itself. Why was it found so far from the house? Why was it left behind at all? A crime of passion rarely includes careful disposal, and a calculated murder rarely includes such chaos. Then there is the nature of the attack. 2 heavy blows, not hesitant, not defensive, but delivered with force and certainty. Was this the act of a battered woman finally breaking, or the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing? History offers no verdict, only fragments. What we do know is this: Margaret Hossack lived for decades under violence. The law did not protect her, society did not intervene, and when her husband died, the justice system turned its full weight against her. Whether she was a murderer or a survivor pushed beyond endurance, her story exposes a deeper truth, that sometimes the most important evidence is not found in weapons or wounds, but in silence, in fear. In their lives, people are forced to endure behind closed doors. Margaret Hossack was never legally convicted. She was never legally exonerated. She died carrying a truth the world never uncovered. And so the question remains, the same question asked in courtrooms, newspapers, and living rooms more than a century ago. Did Margaret Hossack kill her husband? Or was she simply the most convenient suspect in a system that refused to see her pain? In the end, history offers no answers, only echoes. And somewhere in rural Iowa, a farmhouse once stood, a bed where a man died, and a woman whose silence still speaks louder than any verdict ever could. Because some mysteries aren't solved, they're inherited.